Okay, hello everyone, and welcome to California Wine Institute's Behind the Wines with our host, Elaine Chukan Brown. Thank you all for taking the time out to be with us today. This month, California Wine Institute's Behind the Wines series brings a regional focus to our continued exploration of the development of the Golden State's wine industry and its place on the world stage. Our host, Elaine, will speak with leading authorities in wine media, education, hospitality, and science to weigh in on the state of California wine and offer insights about general perceptions on the subject in their respective communities. These conversations will highlight the exchanges between California and other great wine regions of the world, the common threads, as well as the varied approaches to viticulture and winemaking. And today we have the great pleasure to welcome Esther Mobley and Kelli White. So before we get started, some housekeeping reminders for everyone. During the webinar, note that there are two communication methods available to participants, a chat section and a Q&A section. The chat section is an informal way for you to communicate with other participants. Just be sure to select everyone in the to field, as it can default to panelists only. And then the Q&A section, and this is where we'd like you to submit your questions to be answered during the webinar. We will do our best to address your questions, and for those that are not answered live, we will provide in a Q&A summary in the email you'll receive following the program. Now I'd like to introduce our host and guests. Elaine, in addition to writing for her own site, Waka Waka Wine Reviews, she serves as the American specialist for JancysRobinson.com and contributes to a long list of respected publications. She contributed to the 8th edition of the World Atlas of Wine, which has won multiple awards, and as well as the award-winning 4th edition of the Oxford Companion to Wine. She was named by the International Wine and Spirits Competition and Vinitaly as one of the world's top wine communicators of the year for the last 2 years in a row. And we have Esther and Kelli. Esther has held the position of wine critic at the San Francisco Chronicle since 2015. Previously, she was an assistant editor at Wine Spectator in New York, and she was the 2019 Feature Writer of the Year in the Louis Roederer International Wine Writers Awards, and has twice earned first place for wine writing in the Association of Food Journalists Awards. Kelli is the Director of Education at Pacific Union Company. Prior to her current role, she was the senior staff writer for the educational nonprofit Guildsom, and before that worked as sommelier for nearly a decade between New York City and Napa Valley. In 2015, she published her first book, the acclaimed Napa Valley Then and Now, and she recently contributed to the latest edition of Jancis Robinson and Hugh Johnson's World Atlas of Wine. She's also won 2 Louis Roederer International Wine Writing Awards. Right now, Elaine, I'll turn it over to you.
Yay! I'm so excited to do this today. Yay! Thank you to both of you for making time. Things have been a little chaotic this last week, so I really appreciate you both being here. Thank you for that. I want to go ahead and address some questions that I know people have before we get started with the discussion. You know, we have an international audience, and people have been really wondering how California is doing and how things are going with the fires. So I want to go ahead and address that briefly right away in the beginning. And so thankfully, the fires around the state have gotten really good containment in the last week and a half. And so they are subsiding. There is still some smoke in some areas, but people have been able to return home. The different evacuation areas have been reduced simply to warnings or been removed from evacuation status altogether, which is great. The really important thing to remember about the fires is that California is a very big state, and while multiple areas were affected by fires, a lot of the state actually was not affected by fires at all. And so 2020 is going to be a really interesting and varied vintage. I spent a lot of time talking to different producers in the last couple of weeks, and I actually went out and watched harvests in a few places. And the amazing thing is that fruit quality is actually incredibly good this year. So there's the potential for some really good wines to come out of 2020. In areas affected by it, people are aware of smoke exposure, but all of the producers I spoke to were being very intentional and purposeful about that. A lot of people are taking small samples before deciding to harvest in order to check if there's any smoke exposure impact on wines. So while different people will have to make decisions around the question of smoke exposure, people are being very purposeful about it. And a lot of people also are working with UC Davis researchers in order to facilitate greater knowledge around the impact of smoke as well. So in the long term, we're going to gain a lot of insight on the subject. So I just wanted to kind of give people a quick overview on how things are going. Again, people are able to return home in most of the state now, which is really good news. So I just wanted to address that at the beginning because we have a great opportunity to have a really interesting conversation with Kelli and Esther today. And so I want us to be able to go ahead and focus on that. So again, Kelli and Esther, thank you. It's an especially busy time of year. So to have both of you here is really exciting. You're both people I love seeing in person when the opportunity arises. So to get to have you both on screen is wonderful.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, thanks, Elaine. This is fun.
So, what the three of us talked about addressing today is really very simply like the state of California wine and the future of California wine. And the three of us have this really interesting sort of jogged perspective. Kelli, you arrived here in 2010. I got here in 2012, and Esther, you arrived in 2015. And so we each came at kind of different periods of evolution over the last decade plus. And the three of us also have spent so much time really in-depth discussion and contact with producers all over the state as well. So we all three have very in-depth insight into the state of wine here in California, yet also work in very different ways. And so I'm excited to see how this discussion goes. And I really want to treat it more as a roundtable rather than just an interview. So feel free to, pester each other as well. But the thing we decided to start with, we're actually, one of the wines that we're going to talk about today is White Rock Vineyards. They're Claret. And White Rock, of course, is a second generation winery. It's been in Napa for a good amount of time now. And Kelli, you're uniquely positioned. You wrote an entire book on Napa Valley. You worked, in press restaurant and created an incredibly deep cellar of Napa Valley wines. And now again, have seen sort of how it's moving forward. And that puts us in a really great position to start with just the question of, what's the future of luxury wine? Napa is very much associated with that idea of luxury. It's not the only thing it does, but just to get us started, let's go ahead and begin there. What's the future of Napa Valley? How has it changed since you arrived? And how do you see that question, the future of luxury wine?
Well, I think, first of all, that's a very intense question. So thanks for starting out gently. But I will say that, a lot of that depends on how you define luxury wine, right? I think in Napa, probably most people, when they think about Napa and luxury wine, they're thinking about, expensive Cabernet Sauvignon, right? Like above $100 a bottle retail, right? So let's talk about that first. And that's been really interesting because in the last 5 or so years, there's been an increasing amount of media attention on the generational kind of handover in wine to the millennial generation, to younger drinkers, and the changing drinking patterns that's kind of bringing. And a lot of that media coverage, I think, has been like borderline hysterical, right? Like they're killing, what they're killing Napa Cabernet, they're killing this, they're killing that, no alcohol, low alcohol, and then some other like more important stuff too, like a better focus on more sustainable farming, a better focus on like fair labor practices, et cetera, stuff like that. So how does that impact Napa Valley's kind of super premium Cabernet landscape? I think the important thing to remember about Napa Valley is that even though there is kind of an outsized attention on the wines, right, there is really very little wine coming out of Napa Valley when you measure it. And especially when you start dialing into like the premium Cabernet sector, right? Napa is considered planted out at 45,000 acres. Like, that's not a particularly big region, and it's probably not going to grow from there. And it's just a small amount of wine. It's, less than around 1% of California's wine output, right? I'm sorry, 4% of California's wine output. So it's a small amount of wine. So in that sense, that kind of isolates it a little bit from some of these larger movements. So that's one thing. And then the other thing is that I think that we have a tendency in general to oversimplify trends and things, right? And so when we, and I include myself, have talked about the new generation of wine drinkers and sort of millennial trends, like we talk about millennials as if they're one thing, this like completely homogenous group of drinkers with all the same priorities, which are, wellness, natural wine. We sort of associated certain categories with that generation when there's hardcore capitalist millennials, there's millionaire millennials is a thing, especially in the Bay Area. And there is a lot of younger interest in that super premium category of wine still. And so, I'm not particularly doom and gloom about it. I don't think that necessarily means that people in Napa aren't paying attention and adjusting practices and trying to, respond and understand these forces that are at change. But I also don't think anybody's particularly scared.
Right. Well, and Napa has really actually done quite a bit of work in terms of evolving our thinking around sustainability and increasing like salmon safe measures and looking at helping to develop regenerative agriculture and viticulture as well. And also, healthcare programs for vineyard workers. So Napa's actually done quite a lot to help with these different practices that you're referencing, but Esther, you've written on this, and like even in your first year or two there at San Francisco Chronicle, right away, you sort of tackled the Napa versus other aspects of California in that question. And so how, in the time you've been here, how have you seen this sort of perspective evolve?
Well, I think one very concrete way we can see it evolve is the focus among Napa Valley luxury wineries on kind of experiential visitor stuff, and it's not just confined to Napa, but it seems like more and more there's this sense of people really want to be up close and personal. They want to know who the winery is. And I think that's a real departure from a previous era where there was a bit more of a wall and a bit more of an air of mystery around some of the more luxurious, high-end exclusive wines. And I think there's like a hunger to know now. And we live in this era where we're kind of overexposed to each other, especially now. And I think I don't think that the kind of luxury tier of California or Napa wine is going away either, but I think there's going to be a different kind of mood to the way people want to interact with those kinds of brands.
Well, I agree with that. Oh, sorry, Elaine, go ahead.
No, please.
I do agree with that. I think, in the previous generation, and even kind of when I first got here, that lingering mystique of the house on the hill that you don't have the gate code for, you want to get on the mailing list and that's sufficient. Now there's more of a driver for intimacy. So I agree, it's been interesting to see that shift to more experiential based, interactions with consumers here in Napa. But I think, that's driven in part, in my opinion, by consumer interests and the generational kind of shift. But I also think it's driven by the financial realities of running a successful winery in California, in that, it's more and more important for wineries to sell direct to consumer. And the best way to do that is, through a lot of times through wine tourism and getting people in your yard. So, part of it, I'm sure, is listening to trends and reading the Nielsen reports and understanding that that's what consumers are looking for now. But I also think it's just a financial reality of balancing wines and distribution with the need to cultivate, a more robust DTC programming just to make it pencil.
Well, and that's something that's emerged, Kelly, in the time that you've been here. After the global financial crisis in 2008, the entire wine industry, and especially in California, really pivoted to that direct to consumer in person, that it really took off at that point. And And that's something Vino Girl's asking too, how have we seen kind of the pandemic impacting these kinds of questions around experience and direct sales? And, one of the things I've seen is wineries that have a mixed model where they are doing a lot of direct to consumer restaurant and also retail. It's been hard because they're, at least one of those is impacted, but it's also kind of spread out their potential for stability too. But how are you both seeing wineries respond to sort of the current situation this year?
Well, I mean, first of all, I think it has been a lot harder for high-end wineries. That's my sense, largely because they depend on restaurant sales in a lot of cases. And then, of course, the kind of DTC model is so dependent on tasting rooms in a lot of cases and people actually coming. But one thing and we know that off-premise retail wine sales have been booming during COVID, maybe not as much now as they were kind of at the beginning of it back in March, but the winners of that are often not the really high-end wineries. They're the larger volume wineries that have a bigger presence in supermarkets, et cetera. But I don't know what is, how wineries really have adapted so far. I think this is like a moment when wineries are having to begin a kind of longer process of adapting in the long run to e-commerce. And I mean, at the beginning of this pandemic, we were quoting figures from Rob McMillan about how for the average small California winery, I think online e-commerce sales represent only about 3% of revenue. And that's just so different from the way everyone else buys everything these days. I mean, like the way we buy things in general in our lives has completely transformed in the last decade. And it feels like the wine industry is still catching up to that in a major way.
I think there's also, we can bring it back to White Rock for a minute, and like they make the perfect kind of case study in like how their business has evolved to address all of these things. And that, I was speaking to Christopher this morning actually, and he was saying that as they've grown their DTC sales over the last decade, they had to hire a full-time hospitality person because he and his father could no longer accommodate, 15 tours a week or whatever. And then when the pandemic started in April, he said they hired a full-time phone person, which I think is so wonderfully old school. I'm imagining like a lady on a switchboard to call all of their customers and have a friendly conversation. Obviously the goal is ultimately selling wine, but also just to check in and, keep the connection going over the phone, which, that's a new position, but like that's how they've decided to respond to this. And I think it's kind of both brilliant and old school, which is cool.
Well, it speaks quite a bit though to what you were just saying, Esther, about people wanting that more direct contact. And, I know one of the recent studies that came out from, or the study's still being done, but they released some of the data. One of the current MW students did a lot of polling with wineries and wine club membership. And the greatest retention with wine club members was in wineries that actually instigate contact beyond just the regular shipments. Which once it's said, it's sort of an obvious point, but the thing is, that's a new situation. People wanting more contact with who they buy products from, and specifically wine too. But let's go ahead and talk about and taste the White Rock, the Claret. This is one of, it's a favorite wine of mine, but it's also, in my mind, it's an interesting example of California wine and thinking about what do we mean by Bordeaux blends here in the state, because there's a way in which even just the name implies sort of a throwback to another time, but it's a style in my mind that's kind of reemerged in popularity and interest. It's kind of re-inspired a lot of new winemakers. But Kelli, go ahead and talk to us about, why did you select this wine?
Yeah, so we had in our kind of pre-conversation, we were talking about ways for the kind of youthful drinker to engage with Napa Valley, and I think that this is a great example of a wine that really should check a lot of boxes for our kind of imaginary millennial drinker, and their priorities that we've assigned to them, and so I thought it would be an interesting wine to talk about, and also I think one of the things that all three of us have written about, commented on, and certainly discussed previously, that part of the future of California wine is very much mining from its own past. And so not only is this a historic winery and a historic wine name, but they're doing a lot of kind of pre-technology stuff here that I think really resonates with, certainly resonated with me when I first got to Napa Valley, and I think even perhaps more so drinkers younger than me. So Claret is an interesting word that we could probably have an entire Zoom seminar just on the evolution of that term and wines that have been bottled under that name. But here it's an obvious reference to, as Elaine intimated, a Bordeaux blend. This particular vintage goes one step further in that this was also just a field blend, a single pick, single tank field blend. And Christopher winemaker, Christopher Van Den Driesch, prides himself on being like a blending winemaker. He says he really enjoys blending. He makes his best wines through blending. But this year, they have a relatively small vineyard, kind of picked what was ripe all in the same day, put it in a tank, and then just weren't able to improve upon it from there through more blending. So left it as is. The other thing that's really cool about this wine is that it changes from year to year. So I also have the 17 here. And, while this 16 that we're trying is legally Cabernet Sauvignon, it could put that on the label because in California, you have to have a minimum of 75% of the grape variety, and it's 83, 86. The 17 is only 51% Cabernet Sauvignon. And so it's also really kind of hearkening back to the point of a Bordeaux blend in that, in the beginning, which was almost like responding to the strengths and weaknesses of a given vintage. How did the Merlot perform that year? Is it more or less of a presence in the blend? How was was there shatter in the Cabernet? And instead of kind of forcing the wine to have a consistent product, vintage to vintage for the market, and forcing it to conform to these kind of artificially imposed legal standards, they just let this wine fly its freak flag every year and be what it is. And it's also not that expensive. So, and that's a real, I think, cost of wine in Napa Valley is a real, that's the thing we need to keep talking about. It's definitely a barrier of entry for a lot of drinkers, especially younger drinkers. This wine retails for $54, I think. And they haven't really raised the price much since they've been making it since the 70s. So, I mean, there's a lot to love in this wine. It's also delicious, mostly native yeast, all that good stuff, very, very, very responsible farming, minus certifications, but, no pesticides, no herbicides, all that stuff. Family run wineries, small production, all of the boxes, are getting checked for these young drinkers. And it's great. It has, I think, a lot to offer, and it's very well made in my opinion.
Well, and Christopher, we're featuring the 16, but Christopher is kind enough to give us the 17 as well. And it's super fun to taste them side by side because they're actually quite different. The thing I love about the 16, which I think is true of the vintage in general for Cabernet, is it's so detailed. Yeah. And, but in a very elegant, easy sort of way, there's all this detail, but it's one of the other changes I've seen, I think the evolution in California is red wines and varieties like Cabernet. People have, learned tannin management in a different way. And so wines are more approachable younger, but it's not that they're being made to be soft. It's just that people understand how to work with the tannin in a way that retains ageability and yet makes it more drinkable young. And I really see that in both of these vintages of White Rock as well.
Yeah, I will say actually, we could talk about, I don't want to take things in too crazy of a direction, but we could also just spend a lot of time talking about tannin evolution in the time that I've been here because, I think there is this kind of new interest in strong tannins, and not that these wines have that, but sometimes the White Rock wines do. And tannin is something that kind of people were trying to deny around here in Cabernet Sauvignon in the early 2000s and make that really approachable style. And now kind of tannins back in fashion. And I think that's just a great thing in general, and also great for these wines. And I have history with these wines, and these wines age really well. And I think part of that is just the quality winemaking. Part of it is the natural balance, but part of it is also that they're not over ripening the tannin. They're they're knit into the wine.
Yeah, there's kind of a rustic quality to this. It's not a super polished wine, and the tannins are a little bit chewy. I know it's not really a mountain vineyard, but it's on this kind of it's in the hills, and there's also a sweetness to the fruit. I mean, it's not an austere wine. It feels kind of generous in its fruit expression, and that feels a little old school to me too.
Yeah, it just feels like a really honest wine to me. And the soils are really shallow there, like you're saying, Esther. It's on a slope, and so the soils are pretty shallow, and so they get plenty of concentration in the wine. But part of what's come out in this discussion too is just one of the challenges California has internationally is the price question. And Kelli, you and I have spent a lot of time kind of talking about California wine in other parts of the world and around the country as well. And this is a question I get asked a lot. Well, these other places in the world are less expensive. US wines tend to be more expensive. It's not just California. But I actually intentionally decided for my wine pick today, I was going to pick a wine that totally goes against that point and stands up at the same time. And so for the second wine, I chose Lohr Valdiguié from Monterey. And one of the questions that came in earlier was if we could talk about kind of less discussed areas and varieties of California. And I think that the Valdiguié hits that point, and also really gets at another aspect of what I think all three of us have agreed has really been emerging, is just a lot more interest in less discussed varieties. But the thing about Valdiguié I find so fun is that it's actually been here all along. It's another case of California is rediscovering what it has already, and so but I just think this is a reliably solid wine, super drinkable, really fun. But Esther, this is also your first time trying this particular wine, so I'm excited to hear your thoughts on it, and just that idea of wine from Monterey, $10 price point, which a lot of people think doesn't happen here, but really producers in California are more and more aware of creating wines that are more affordable.
That's a great $10 wine. I mean, that's a great wine, but it's kind of incredible that that's a $10 wine. It's, it's just kind of fresh and energetic. It's super fruity, but in this kind of really beautiful way. I mean, I think when I think of $10 wines, I think of them often as being, there's often, they can be really fruity, but in a kind of candied or excessively ripe way. And this is this is really fun. This is a fun wine.
It's really cheerful. It's just, you taste it. That's tasty. It's my first time tasting it too.
I didn't realize. Yeah, no, this is a favorite go-to for me, just because, again, it's Valdiguié. A lot of people don't even know what that is, but it's been increasing in popularity and interest. We've had it in California, like I said, all the way back, so to speak. But until the end of the 80s, we thought it was Gamay. We'd kind of made a mistake, and then ampellographer from France came to visit, and he's walking vineyards and was like, "Oh, you have Valdiguié here? How unusual!" And we're like, "No, it's Gamay." And no, it's Valdiguié. So it's a great example of how California is kind of rediscovering what it has already. And one of the things I'm interested in hearing about, from both of you too, is I think California is in this really beautiful, interesting place in its own evolution, in that we have done enough now that we can look to ourselves for inspiration. And I want to be really careful in how I say that, because I think that we could mistake that as meaning we don't need to look elsewhere. And I'm saying, no, it's absolutely essential for our own continued development that we keep looking to the world of wines and seeing our relationship to other regions. But at the same time, we have such a profound history that we can actually be inspired by our own, accomplishments in the state as well. And I feel like the Valdiguié is an example of that. Monterey has been one of the backbones of the state for a very long time. And Lohr, multi-generational, I think, family-owned winery as well. They're in Monterey.
Well, I think, oh, sorry, go ahead, Esther.
Well, Elaine, what's the history of Valdiguié in Monterey? We associate it much more with Napa and areas around.
Yeah, so my understanding is Valdiguié really was throughout the state, but kind of to the northern part of the Central Coast. It didn't really get into the southern part of the Central Coast or Southern California. And so there's this whole history of association with Napa Valley because people were trying to make Beaujolais inspired wines from Napa Valley. And so they called it Napa Gamay. But actually there's been Valdiguié all the way down into as far as Paso. And so it's been in Monterey. But yeah, like you're saying, the history of association is very much North Coast more, but there's Old Vine Valdiguié throughout Sonoma County as well. There's a tiny bit in Mendoza. Yeah. And then Napa Solano. And Lohr is really kind of leading the charge with it in Monterey at this point. But it's just it's such an example, like you're both saying, of like friendly, delicious, lovely wine. And I've been able to use this wine in seminars around the US, but also with people from other countries. And this is a wine that every single time they want to know what it is, they're stunned when they find out what it is, and then they really can't believe it when they find out the price, because it just over delivers.
Well, one thing I think is so cool is this is a style of wine that I think feels kind of trendy and new. It's light. It's got this real kind of like crunchy, bright fruit to it. And the variety seems like it's kind of following in this this kind of craze for Beaujolais style wines that we're experiencing now. But there's nothing new about this wine. Lohr's been making it for quite a while, like totally blind to any trends that may have existed. And this style of wine has just been around here for a really long time.
I think the point that you made about kind of California not necessarily needing to measure itself against, classic wine regions of the world, specifically Europe anymore, is something worth dwelling on, because, I know that it's interesting. It's like that still, I think, compulsive comparison to Europe was really important when California was kind of establishing its identity, right? You're like, okay, this is the reference, so we're gonna form ourselves in, let's say, France's model, right? Napa becomes Bordeaux, Sonoma becomes Burgundy, Paso is the Rhone, maybe the Syrah foothills is Languedoc, and then we sort of like, derive some some information from that modeling. But that can also be extremely limiting too. I remember when I was buying wine at press, and I would have producers come to taste me on wines all the time. And I remember constantly getting frustrated at producers being like, this is my Burgundian style Chardonnay. And it's like, well, what does that mean? Because it could either mean this is my lower alcohol style of Chardonnay. It could mean this was my oak aged Chardonnay. It could sometimes mean this is my less oaky Chardonnay. It was just a completely undefined term, and it was distracting and not giving any information. And I think that, you still see that at people that like package their Merlot as like a right bank, wine and things like that. And that's fine. There's information there. But like Elaine, like you said, I think it's okay for wines to be just Californian in reference, and that there is a lot of value there, and it, we have that formative influence, and it's okay now to just like look inward and figure out what's here and derive strength and identity from that.
In the last several years, especially, the thing I've seen more and more in doing interviews with producers is when I ask them, what are your inspirations? Where did you, how did you come to arrive at this style? It's more and more often that people are referencing other California producers that have really pushed their thinking about what's possible here, and they'll, a lot of top producers will also mention, my first love was such and such international wine, But when they talk about in a more tactile way about, well, how did they come to understand they want to make their own wine? They're actually referencing other California producers that have kind of shown them what's possible, and that kind of, but for me, it's really exciting to see, because it's a very different stage of creative evolution from thinking you don't need anyone else. You only need your own region or your own wine. That's more of a sort of a closed sort of view that makes it harder to evolve. But what we're talking about is this moment where we're aware of a global influence, but also the sort of work being done here is so substantial. People are just naturally being inspired by each other right here in California.
It's almost like a maturity arc that like you can put in a metaphor of context of a single person. It's like you're so influenced by your parents growing up, and then you get out and you're into college and you're really influenced by your friends and your professors, and then at a certain age, you're able to kind of pick and choose from those influences, but also like know yourself a little bit more. I mean, it feels like a natural, not to sound condescending, but it feels like a natural kind of point in the evolution of California wine that feels exciting.
Yeah. So
I think
Esther,
there's no better segue to Petite Syrah from that.
Yeah. Well, and so Esther, this is a wine that you selected.
Yeah, and I see that Scott, the winemaker, is in the call. So hi. This wine is Mountain Tides Petite Syrah, California appellation, and just as luck would have it, my story about this wine label went online this morning. So you can all go read that at sfchronicle.com/wine. But I think Petite Syrah is such a cool California story because it's essentially a grape variety that doesn't really have a meaningful lived experience anywhere other than California. And it's been part of California viticulture for, almost as long as almost any vinifera grape has been grown here. But it's really taken a long time for it to come into its own, I think. And a lot of people, I think, associate Petite Syrah with a kind of monstrous, just kind of aggressive wine that attacks your palate. And I think even lovers of that style of Petite Syrah know that they've long been an underdog in it. Many producers formed an organization called PS I Love You to try to, promote the grape variety and kind of celebrate its beauty. And so what Mountain Tides is doing is making Petite Syrahs. They make single vineyard Petite Syrahs from a lot of different vineyards and kind of are taking this terroir focused view of it. But then they make this, I think, great value $20 California appellation blend of several of the different vineyards. It's kind of a village versus a cru, single vineyard model. And I think this wine, it expresses a lot of the kind of exuberance and energy of the Valdiguié, although certainly it's a kind of more substantial and structured wine like that. I don't think it's denying its identity as Petite Syrah. I think it's kind of embracing that rustic, chewy, dense quality. But I also think this is a Petite Syrah that I can get really excited about and that feels like it has some finesse to it and isn't just kind of a monolith.
One of the really important early lessons I got in coming to know California wine over the years was two different experiences. One with Tegan Passalacqua, who of course makes wines for Turley and his own Sandlands, but then also tasting with Paul Draper at Ridge. Turley works with one of, I would argue one of the really important vineyards in the state, because genuinely old vine Petite Syrah in St. Helena, Napa Valley area. And then Ridge has worked with Petite Syrah, since the 70s, from kind of mountainside Napa Valley and now Sonoma County as well. And the thing that I experienced with both of them was tasting older Petite Syrah. And there's a way in which I didn't understand what Petite Syrah is as a variety until I got to have it aged. And it, I think of it as if the baby fat melts off, so 10, 15, 20 years in, it's like the baby fat melts off and suddenly all of these gorgeous floral aromatics and really lithe, elegant wine emerges. And when I realized that's consistently what happens with Petite, I started wondering, well, who can show that when it's young? Is it that it can't show it when it's young? Or is it that it's a stylistic choice now that obscures that? And the thing that I like about what Mountain Tides is doing is there's a way in which capturing and preserving those aromatics, those floral elements, seems to me integral to the project, you know?
This is beautiful.
Yeah, I think it is a very floral wine. Someone in the chat is mentioning its genetic parents are Syrah and Pellerson. And I think there's that kind of Syrah violet purple flower thing going on here.
I will say I agree with Elaine. Some of my favorite kind of older wines when we were building the cellar at Press were old Petite Syrahs, you know, especially like the Ridge, what were they called? Devils.
Yorkville Highlands is one of the main ones, yeah.
Yeah, but anyway.
York Creek.
Yeah, from the 70s
yeah.
were beautiful, beautiful. And they just don't budge. I mean, this is a grape variety that has, I think, probably has so much intensity and density that it just doesn't budge. They live forever, and they're very inexpensive. If you follow auction markets or the gray market or secondary markets at all, one, they're typically like an afterthought, very inexpensive, and there is like zero chance of fake wine. There's no risk.
They're not going to be counterfeit, you mean?
No risk of counterfeit old Petite Syrah.
I love it from a cultural perspective too, because Esther, like you were just saying, you know, Petite Syrah really developed its character and found out what it is and who it is here in California. You know, it was made as an intentional cross in France, but didn't really take off there. And it the growing conditions in California suit it quite well. And it's now actually there's a significant planting of it in Israel, and then in Australia it does well, but under its original name Darif. You know, so it's now emerging in other areas. But there's, you know, we talk about Zinfandel as the iconic California variety, but I actually think Petite Syrah arguably is really California's wine at the same time. You know, it's just a difference of volume.
I agree. And, you know, when you think about what would have made it an attractive grape variety to plant in the late 1900s, late 1800s, early 20th century, you know, it's those same qualities, the kind of the structure, the firmness of the tannins, the intense color. I mean, it's just the kind of wine that girds itself. And it's like it, you know, now we're kind of rediscovering the beauty in that. It wasn't just like a kind of survival technique, but that those wines actually, there's a kind of grace to that. And I love that, I mean, I love old vines and grape varieties that have been around for a long time, and the kind of history you can lift from seeing how these vineyards were planted and what they've done. But I just think it's another really cool example of California, as you put it, Kelly, mining its own history and finding a way forward.
The other thing about this wine, though, too, is, and I was saying this to Kelly yesterday, that in my mind, now is the first time in wine that we could have a California appellated wine, so a multi-regional blend, and have it be taken seriously. I think that's a really important shift that's happened in kind of general wine thinking, that there's been a history for decades now of assuming that the best wines in the world are single variety, single vineyard. And so there is an assumption that if it was a wine was a multi-regional blend, the quality was lower, when that clearly is not necessarily true. But I think that it's taken until now for there to be kind of room in sort of the wine public, so to speak, for us to see, no, this is a California appellated wine. It's actually made from Mendocino, Sonoma, Napa, Contra Costa, Lodi, Sierra foothills fruit. And it's a gorgeous wine. And the advantage of having that multi-regional approach is it's a little bit easier to make it more affordable too. So again, a $20 bottle of wine. But I'm curious to hear, you know, your thoughts on that shift in perspective from assuming single variety or single vineyard is sort of paramount, to now we're seeing, you know, lesser known varieties, lesser known regions, and also multi-regional blends emerging and being taken seriously at the same time.
Well, I think sorry, Esther, did you want to?
Go for it. Go for it.
Okay. I mean, I think that in some ways, for like, again, thinking about premium wines, you know, having a tie to a specific piece of land is still an important kind of part of that story. And like having a single variety, well, that's just sort of, you know, what California has historically done, well, or has done in modern history. But there's something very kind of aristocratic about terroir, right? And putting terroir at the front and center of the story, putting the land in the front and center of the story. Like it's a beautiful, like earthy experience, but it's also aristocratic. Like some terroirs are better than others, right? And so there's something like really kind of excitingly like democratic or like socialist about these multi-regional blends. And I think, you know, I don't think it's a coincidence that we're seeing a renewed interest in that from a quality lens while retaining value at a time when we're experiencing those kind of same conversations in the political sphere of our life. Like I feel like wine and wine trends are intimately tied in like political and socioeconomical trends, and we don't spend enough time thinking about that. But to me, these feel like kin.
Yeah, I mean, I think too, some of the emergence of that happening more and more is out of financial necessity for the winemakers. Like a lot of, you know, upstart winemakers can't afford marquee single vineyards and can't often afford certain grape varieties that now the fruit costs have kind of ballooned, and certainly in certain regions. So, I mean, I think there's been kind of a forced creativity to a lot of the kind of satellite regions that have been overlooked. And I think that's to the consumer's benefit that we're seeing kind of new types of wines, and certainly that are being made in this really, with a real eye to value.
Elaine, do you think that there's any kind of synergy between this kind of what feels like to me an opening up of the wine industry to include like wine products, right? Which is still obviously like niche, but like blue wine or, you know, these kind of like newish wine products that like we're starting to, it feels like, be more open to the idea of moving away from like the single vineyard, single thing in like these bigger ways. Is that having an influence, do you think, on these multi-regional?
Well, I don't know that. I mean, there's also gold fleck wine, which I just think is incredibly, it's so, what a bold move, you know, like I'm going to put gold leaf in the bottle and it'll float around. Like, I just, you know, that's a very different kind of creativity, you know, blue wine, another different kind of creativity. In my mind, like, I don't think that blue wine or gold wine are influencing multi-regional blends as much as the, public is opening up to what wine can be. Right. And I actually think the wine industry needs to be really careful in how it approaches this, because the truth is that a lot of the wine cognoscenti, to put it that way, like there's a lot of people that, not producers, but people that talk about wine. So like are the three of us, right? Like we're people that we are in wine, but by talking about it and keeping in contact with what's going on and sharing the news, so to speak. A lot of people in our kind of role end up taking a very protectionist role and act against these crazy, you know, like Hello Kitty wine or blue wine, you know. But I think actually wine needs to take a lesson that if wine wants to survive and do well, it needs to allow a semi-permeable membrane. It needs to allow these kinds of creativity of exploration, you know. So multi-regional wine is sort of a soft example in the sense that it's still clearly wine, right? But my point is that I think if we want to expand the audience for wine, which we clearly need to do to support sales, we need to be willing to allow that there's going to be crazy, weird wine styles that emerge and crazy, weird wine experiments. We don't have to drink them, but we also shouldn't be shaming other people for wanting to try them.
Well, no, sorry.
Okay. I like to try and balance the two sides of my personality a lot, right? So I have this like 20-year career in like, you know, fine wine, luxury wine. And then I have, you know, I come from a family that doesn't drink wine, that doesn't have a lot of money, that doesn't have a lot of resources. And like, I always try to, when I feel myself wanting to pull in this like protectionist, as you said, direction, and really be more kind of rigid in what I view as what both wine and fine wine, I try to lean the other way deliberately. And my mother, you know, her favorite wine is a sparkling pineapple wine that she buys at Trader Joe's. I'm pretty sure it's under $10. It's her favorite wine, and my husband makes wine. So it's like, really, you know, we have to pay attention to this wine. And what am I going to do? Tell her that she's wrong, you know, that her tastes don't count, that her impulses are bad? I mean, and I've tried it, and it's delicious, you know. It's very like enjoyable, you know. It's not, you know, nobody's going to write a poem about it, but it's, you know, it is interesting. And I think that, you know, we, like Elaine said, I think what you said is so important. Like, we have to be careful. We have to stop telling people that they're wrong, you know, and open our arms wider and expand the conversation. I mean, I think this is the problem that we're in with, you know, the kind of old guard wine community, you know, poo-pooing natural wine all the time. That's what's turned it into such a, like, you know, punk badge of honor, is because, you know, there's so many people just being like, well, I don't know. Well, that's a great way to, you know, make yourself irrelevant and to, you know, shut down people's interest when, you know, that interest could evolve in a direction eventually that you're more approving of. I don't know.
Well, and I want to be clear too that there's plenty of obscure high-end wines I love drinking and I absolutely support. Like, I'm in no way speaking against single vineyard wines or single variety wines, or, you know, I'm just saying, like, we need to allow people to have their own views, you know. And I think, you know, I think the wine industry has inadvertently kind of made itself obscure by taking a bit of an elitist tone, you know, that historically. And that's one of the things that I think is shifting, that I'm really happy about. Like, it's possible to be insatiably curious, super intelligent, and still really approachable and inclusive, you know. And I think that's something that we're seeing shift in wine. The wine conversation is expanding. And with that, we're seeing a parallel in wine styles expanding as well. And, you know, Eric Asmoff is on the call right now as well. And one of the comments he made is like, it's so great we're seeing these multi-regional blends emerging. You know, again, with Mountain Tides, part of how they're able to support the single vineyard Petite Syrahs is by also making this multi-regional Petite Syrah, you know, which it's a little easier to sell and, you know, brings together wine from across the state. But the point Eric was making was, you know, there's a little bit of multi-vintage wine emerging too. I don't see as much of that, but there's a tiny bit of that too. And I think as we look at climate change and sort of vintage variation, that's something we should be open to producers using as a solution as well.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think there has to be some kind of loosening of like what makes a great wine is that it's single vineyard, single vintage, you know, single variety. I mean, there's many exceptions to that, even at the high end in California. I mean, I think, Kelli, what you're saying about the kind of hostile relationship that somehow got established between natural wine and the rest of the wine world is a perfect example of like a tension that doesn't really, I think, necessarily need to be there. It's like somehow someone's drawn a line and said like, this is one thing and this is another thing. I mean, I think to me, blue wine and gold fleck wine are a bit like novelty, flash in the pans, but I think the more kind of permanent threat, or let's say long lasting threat, is like the hard seltzer world. Right. Even all the kind of adjacent products, the canned cocktails, canned wine spritzers. And I mean, to be clear, I don't think those have to be a threat to wine, but I think there's this kind of sense of like, well, that's not real wine. That's like this fake thing. I mean, natural wine producers are making things, you know, grape beverages that I think a lot of people, you know, in some cases wouldn't consider real wine at all. So, I mean, it does just feel like this is the way to drive yourself into, this is the way to alienate the millennial generation, right? To kind of close yourself off to any kind of loosening of the definition of what you are.
It's
Well,
also, go ahead.
No, you go ahead.
Well, I just was going to say, but I think, Kelli implicitly already made the point that it's not just about millennials. Her mom loves pineapple wine, right? And the other big piece of the wine industry is hospitality and service. And surely if our job is to serve the broader community, then that means bringing them what they love, even if that's pineapple wine, right? So in that sense, it would seem openness and responsiveness is fundamental to hospitality, which the wine industry is built on, right? And so it's not just about millennials, it's about the broader audience as a whole.
Yeah, and how inhospitable wine hospitality can be sometimes is, I think, one of the most maddening things to witness, But what I was going to say is that I'm so inspired by this conversation. When we are done here, I'm going to make some phone calls, and I'm going to make a single vineyard canned wine seltzer. It's going to be amazing, and we can film this next year on my yacht.
Awesome.
Yeah,
That's great. Well,
But
so we
we
only have a couple minutes left. So I want to hear from each of you, like, what are you really excited about going forward? What have we not addressed or maybe only mentioned briefly, but that really is actually getting you excited for wine going forward?
Esther, you start.
I don't know if there's one thing I'm excited about. I'm excited for us to all transition out of this COVID stage, and I'm excited for the wine world to kind of continue to modernize. But generally, I think everything I taste these days from California, I mean, there's a higher percentage of wines now that I'm excited about, even I think than there was when I started. I think 5 years ago, there was a real, we're talking about these kind of rifts. I think back then the rift was like between like the wines that thought of themselves as balanced versus not.
Yeah.
And I feel like that is like hardly part of the conversation anymore. And I'm excited by that. I think there's kind of I just think where there's that specific brand of antagonism has eased a little bit. And I taste so many California wines that have a beautiful sense of balance and structure and that seem like they're going to be long-lived. But I also taste a lot of wines that are reveling in being short-lived and kind of young, easy drinking. And I'm really excited by those. So I think we're in a good moment overall.
We had Jamie Good on in July, and he and I were talking about that tension you just referenced, sort of the in pursuit of balance tension that was really strong when you got here, Esther. Like, you got here in the last year IPOB was hosted. And the thing that actually struck me was based on the comments and questions coming in during that discussion, I had to explain what IPOB was. Mm-hmm. It's only been 5 years, but actually the wine industry doesn't necessarily know what IPOB was, but that was a moment that changed the conversation and shifted how people were thinking about wine. And I take it part of your point too is that, natural wine has had that kind of effect in a different way. But actually hard seltzer, which we, think of as outside of wine, it's actually affecting how we think about wine too, and what we think we should be doing moving forward,
Definitely. I think one of the great lessons of hard seltzer is I think Kelli, you talked about this earlier, but if you didn't realize before that people are kind of concerned with this wellness aspect of what they drink, hard seltzer really drives that point home in a powerful way, whether or not it's actually a wellness or should be considered a wellness beverage. So I think there's a lot of lessons to learn there. And I think the kind of wine industry at large needs to learn a lot of lessons about the way they talk about their wines from the natural wine movement too.
Yeah, I would agree with that. For me, I would say the things that I'm excited about going forward, I'll split it in two and talk about Napa and non-Napa, since I would say in Napa, what I'm excited to see, and obviously this isn't universal, right? But I would say that what I'm excited to see in this kind of bastion of single vineyard, single variety, premium wines, what I witness as an increased respect for the voice of the land, I'm starting to see a lot of top brands, expensive brands, where, you know, maybe the single vineyard was there as like a booster to the story, but the story was the brand, right? Or maybe the story was the winemaker. Now doing more sensitive farming, kind of less interventionist winemaking, less like oppressive, like use of oak and ripeness and things, and just a more refined product at the top end of the tier here. And then outside of Napa, I'm just excited by the growth I'm seeing in small businesses like around, and I hope, you know, with the pandemic and everything, that a lot of these people are able to survive. But, you know, when I was traveling around the state for Build Some and doing classes on like Monterey and Mendocino and things like that, and it's interesting how like the financial hardships and increasing difficulties of farming grapes and making wine and selling wine has like forced more vertical integration. And so you're seeing like where like a place like Monterey is a perfect example, where it was dominated by big growers who were also like came to wine grapes out of produce, maybe then were selling their grapes, and they started making their own wine. And then you started seeing a proliferation of tasting rooms that were able to survive because there was a rise in local wine tourism outside of Napa, Sonoma, of San Francisco's going down to Monterey, you know, or people going up to Lake County or whatever. This rise in small family, vertically integrated businesses all up and down the state, making really interesting wines. That's been thrilling to see. And that has really swelled in the last 10 years. And I just hope to God that these businesses can survive. What about you, Elaine?
Well, and it gets at a question that came up earlier that we weren't able to directly address, but just the point that that sort of model also depends on the success of surrounding businesses like restaurants, places to stay. Tourism is tourism, right? So it's not just the wine; it's actually the health of the surrounding community and the things that take care of you when you're traveling. And that's one of the challenges people are facing right now as well. But I'm so thrilled three of us could get together and have this conversation. Vivian in the comments called it spicy. It didn't occur to me we were being spicy, but that's okay. I'll take it. But again, thanks so much to both of you for making time to do this. It's always really good to see both of you. And I hope that the wine industry will keep having more conversations like this. I think what's unique about the work each of us do is we talk to lots of people. And I think the more conversations the wine industry can do, getting together people that talk to lots of people and seeing like what's going on, and kind of building those conversations. I'm excited to see those kinds of topics continue to build, so we can really think about, where are things headed, where are we now, and where have we been in wine.
Elaine, thank you for this whole series. It's amazing. People are loving it. You're so good at what you do. Thank you for being a guiding light. And thank you, Esther. You're awesome too.
Well, I echo that, Elaine, what Kelly said. And it's such a pleasure to be here. And, we're not seeing the faces of all of you, but I see your comments popping up, and it feels so nice to have that engagement with all of you. So thank you.
Yeah, great. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Esther. Thank you, Kelly. Thank you, Elaine. And we just thank all our attendees for participating today. A recording of today's webinar will be published to the California Wine Institute's YouTube channel in the next couple of days, and all participants will receive an email with the link. Excuse me. So remember, you can access all of the previous Behind the Wines episodes on the YouTube channel.